Deep in the emerald heart of the Belgian Congo, where the mighty river carved its ancient path through jungle so thick that sunlight became a stranger, there stood Villa Mbandaka. This colonial mansion rose from the rainforest like a white scar against green flesh, its wide verandas and imported European furnishings a monument to exploitation disguised as civilization. The year was 1923, and within these elegant walls, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows over polished mahogany, a wedding banquet was about to unfold that would transform celebration into carnage. Before we journey into the depths of this extraordinary tale of transformation and retribution, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 15 of the colony's most powerful figures would gather on December 3rd to witness the union of two prominent families. None would see the sunrise. What the guests sipping champagne from Baccarat crystal could never imagine was that their every cruelty, every casual act of violence, every decision that ground human souls into profit had been meticulously catalogued by someone they considered invisible. A woman whose calloused hands had stirred their soups and seasoned their meats, while her mind recorded their sins with the precision of a colonial ledger. The Europeans called her simply the cook, but she had chosen her own name during the long nights when grief transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Como had learned that the most powerful weapon against those who refuse to see your humanity is the very invisibility they impose upon you. On that humid December evening, she would serve justice course by course, proving that some hungers can only be satisfied with blood. Villa Mbandaka sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime riverfront territory in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, its boundaries marked not by fences, but by the understood terror that kept workers within its invisible cage. The estate's wealth flowed from three sources that bled the land and its people dry: rubber trees scarred daily for their milky sap, elephant tusks harvested from the deep forest, and the precious minerals that lay buried beneath ancient soil. Every franc that decorated the mansion's opulent rooms had been extracted through quotas enforced by chicote whips and casual executions. Commandant Philippe Dubois ruled this empire of extraction with the methodical cruelty that characterized Belgian colonial administration. Tall and pale as bleached bone, with eyes the color of Congo River mud, he had arrived in Africa 20 years earlier as a minor bureaucrat and carved himself a kingdom through brutality that impressed even his superiors in Brussels. He firmly believed that Africans were children who required constant discipline, a philosophy that justified the systematic destruction of families, cultures, and lives in service of European prosperity. The villa itself stood as a testament to the wealth that flowed from human suffering. 2 stories of imported limestone crowned with red clay tiles, surrounded by manicured gardens where orchids bloomed in defiance of the jungle that pressed against the compound's edges. Wide verandas wrapped around the structure, furnished with wicker chairs and ceiling fans that stirred the humid air without ever quite dispelling the oppressive heat. Inside, European elegance struggled against tropical reality through expensive furniture shipped upriver at enormous cost, Persian rugs that rotted in the humidity, and oil paintings that cracked in the relentless moisture. The jewel of Philippe's domain was not the rubber or ivory, but the culinary reputation that attracted visitors from across French Equatorial Africa and beyond. Colonial administrators from Kinshasa, Belgian investors touring their African holdings, and French merchants navigating the river trade all ensured they received invitations to Villa Mbandaka dinners. The secret of this fame resided in hands that belonged to a woman most guests never bothered to notice, but whose artistry they savored without question. Imara had arrived at the plantation 8 years earlier in 1915 as part of a group of displaced people fleeing violence in the Bandundu region. She was 20 then, already married to Quito and mother to infant Bomani, her large dark eyes holding depths that spoke of intelligence Europeans preferred not to acknowledge. The head cook at the time, an elderly woman named Mama Uzuri, immediately recognized something special in the young mother and took her under protective wing. Mama Uzuri carried knowledge that stretched back generations, wisdom about the rainforest that surrounded them like a living cathedral. Born in the Kasai region before the colonial partition, she had been trained by healers who understood that every leaf, every root, every flowering vine held secrets of life and death. The jungle provided everything needed for healing, for inducing sleep, for causing pain, and for purposes that wise women discussed only in whispers under moonless skies. For 8 years, Amara learned not merely to cook, but to understand the science behind flavor, the mysteries of fermentation, the delicate balance between nourishment and harm. Mama Uzuri taught her to read the forest like a vast pharmacy, where each plant served specific purposes. Some brought fever down, others induced it. Some healed wounds, others opened them. And some, harvested only during certain seasons and prepared with ancient techniques, served purposes that required great wisdom to employ. The old healer also taught Amara something equally precious in a world that sought to strip every dignity from colonized peoples. She taught her to read and write in both French and Lingala. During humid afternoons when kitchen work slowed, Mama Uzuri showed the young woman how to form letters in the red dust, how to decipher the recipe books that belonged to Madame Dubois, and how to keep careful records of discoveries about plants and their properties. She always emphasized that knowledge represented the only inheritance that could never be stolen or sold. When Mama Uzuri died of malaria in 1921, Amara naturally assumed leadership of the kitchen. She was then 26 years old, mother to 3 children, and recognized throughout the region as possessing skills that rivaled the finest chefs in Kinshasa or even Brussels. Her family occupied one of the larger quarters, a bamboo and mud brick structure with a tin roof that caught rainwater, a privilege granted because her abilities had become essential to Philippe's social ambitions. Philippe rarely addressed Amara directly, communication flowing through his wife, Madame Elise, a nervous woman who spent her days reading French novels and dosing herself with laudanum for various ailments, both real and imagined.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Menus for special occasions by consulting a cookbook that had belonged to her mother, but it was Amara who transformed those European instructions into culinary art adapted to African ingredients and conditions. The kitchen complex stood separate from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that provided some protection during the torrential rains that defined wet season. Built of stone and hardwood with multiple cooking fires and storage rooms, it functioned as Amara's domain where she commanded a staff of 4 assistants, each trained in specific skills. Safina handled breads and pastries, adapting European techniques to work with local grains and the persistent humidity. Zuberi managed meat preparation and smoking, using traditional methods to preserve protein in challenging tropical conditions. Dalila prepared vegetables and fruits, creating preserves and pickles that could survive the climate. But Amara kept the most crucial secrets to herself, the special seasonings that made guests close their eyes in pleasure, the exact timing required to achieve perfect textures in the oppressive heat, and the precise combinations of herbs that transformed simple ingredients into memorable experiences. Amara's children lived in the family quarters but spent considerable time around the kitchen when their other duties permitted. Bomani, now 8 years old, had begun learning basic maintenance tasks around the compound while showing early signs of his father's mechanical aptitude with the estate's aging equipment. Django, 6 years old, displayed curiosity about plants that reminded Amara of her own childhood fascination with the forest. Little Asha, just 4, remained close to her mother whenever possible, playing with corn-husk dolls and singing traditional songs that Amara taught her during quiet moments. Life at Villa Mbandaka followed rhythms dictated by river transport schedules, seasonal weather patterns, and the brutal quotas that governed rubber production. Within the constraints imposed by colonial rule, existence had achieved a certain terrible stability. Amara had learned to protect her family through indispensable skill, understanding that Philippe would never risk losing the cook who guaranteed his social standing among the colonial elite. It was a precarious balance that required constant vigilance, but it had worked for 8 years. The dry season of 1923 brought changes that would shatter this fragile equilibrium forever. Marcel Dubois returned from university in Brussels, carrying European ideas about racial superiority that made even his father's cruelty seem restrained by comparison. At 19, Marcel embodied the worst aspects of colonial privilege. Educated enough to rationalize his prejudices, wealthy enough to act on his impulses, and young enough to believe his power made him invincible. Marcel had spent his university years studying what Europeans called anthropology, learning theories that classified Africans as evolutionary stepping stones between animals and true humans. He returned to Congo convinced that his destiny involved conducting experiments that would advance scientific understanding of racial characteristics. What this meant in practical terms was that Marcel viewed the plantation workers as subjects for his amusement, creatures whose pain served the higher purpose of satisfying his curiosity about the limits of African endurance. Amara first noticed Marcel's presence through changes in behavior among the kitchen staff and other workers. Conversation stopped abruptly when he appeared. Women found reasons to avoid certain areas of the compound when he was present. Men who had worked the plantation for years suddenly displayed nervous energy that spoke of fear rather than respect. But she could not have imagined that her own children would soon attract his attention as perfect subjects for the research he considered his contribution to colonial science. The plantation's social hierarchy functioned like a pyramid built on human suffering. At the apex sat Philippe and his family, supported by a layer of European assistants and specialists who managed different aspects of the operation. Dr. Victor Laurent served as plantation physician, though his primary duty involved keeping workers functional rather than healthy. Father Constantine provided religious justification for the system while collecting substantial fees for his services. Henri Moreau worked as assistant overseer, a position that required enthusiastic participation in the violence that maintained order. Below this European layer existed the Congolese workers, divided into their own complex rankings based on skill, seniority, and favor with the management. Amara occupied a unique position in this hierarchy, technically a laborer but practically indispensable, granted privileges that separated her family from the harshest aspects of plantation life while never allowing them to forget their fundamental vulnerability. The rainy season of 1923 had been particularly brutal, turning roads into impassable mud and isolating Villa Mbandaka from regular contact with the outside world. During these months of enforced isolation, Marcel's boredom grew dangerous. He began organizing what he called educational activities for the younger workers, games designed to teach proper deference while satisfying his need for entertainment. These sessions took place in a storage shed near the rubber processing area, far enough from the main house that screams would not disturb his parents' afternoon rest. Amara sensed the growing tension but could not protect everyone from Marcel's attention. The plantation was too large, her responsibilities too demanding, and his freedom too complete. She focused on keeping her own children close, instructing them to stay near the kitchen complex whenever possible and to find her immediately if Marcel approached them. But children are naturally curious, and 8-year-old Bomani had begun chafing at restrictions that kept him from exploring the fascinating machinery and processes that made the plantation function. It was during this period of heightened anxiety that Élise Dubois began planning what would become the social event of the season. Her daughter Giselle had become engaged to Jean-Baptiste Moreau, eldest son of Auguste Moreau, who operated a neighboring plantation specializing in ivory collection. The wedding would unite two of the region's most powerful families while demonstrating the prosperity and sophistication that characterized Belgium's civilizing mission in Africa. The engagement announcement arrived with the dry season, carried by the first river transport in months. Élise threw herself into planning with the manic energy of someone who rarely had opportunities to demonstrate her cultural superiority. The wedding would take place on December 3rd, the guest list carefully curated to include only the most important colonial figures within reasonable traveling distance. 15 guests in total, plus Philippe, Élise, and Giselle, each representing some aspect of the political and economic network that sustained European dominance in Central Africa.
For weeks, Elise consulted with Amara about menu possibilities. Menus that would showcase both European sophistication and the exotic ingredients available in tropical Africa. The discussions revealed the full extent of who would attend the celebration. Commandant Auguste Moreau and his wife Celeste would arrive with their son, the groom, representing the ivory trade that operated deeper in the forest where elephant herds still moved in massive migrations. Dr. Laurent would attend both as social equal and as insurance against tropical diseases that could strike suddenly during gatherings. Father Constantine would perform the ceremony and bless the union that promised to consolidate Catholic influence in the region. Other guests would include Captain Louis Reynard, military liaison responsible for maintaining order when civilian authority proved insufficient. Monsieur Antoine Beaumont operated river trading posts that moved goods between plantation country and Kinshasa, accompanied by his wife Marguerite, who managed the social networks that determined colonial society rankings. Inspector Charles Fontaine represented direct administrative connection to Brussels, his presence lending official approval to the celebration. Professor Émile Rousseau had arrived from Belgium 6 months earlier to conduct anthropological studies, bringing his wife Brigitte, who documented what she called native customs for European audiences hungry for exotic details. Each name Amara learned was added to a mental catalog that grew more detailed with every conversation she overheard, every letter she glimpsed while cleaning Elise's writing desk, every fragment of gossip that circulated through the kitchen staff. She began to understand not merely who would attend the wedding, but what each person represented in the vast machine of extraction and oppression that had shaped her life since childhood. The wedding menu planning consumed much of November, with Elise changing her mind repeatedly about details that seemed crucial to establishing proper European standards in the African wilderness. The challenge involved creating dishes sophisticated enough to impress guests accustomed to fine dining, while adapting to ingredients and conditions that bore little resemblance to anything found in European cookbooks. Amara had spent years mastering this balance, learning to substitute local spices for unavailable European herbs, to work with tropical fruits that had no continental equivalents, to preserve and prepare proteins in humidity that rotted most foods within hours. As November progressed toward December, Amara began experiencing changes that puzzled her kitchen staff. She had always been methodical, but now her attention to detail bordered on obsessive. She insisted on personally handling every aspect of sauce preparation, refusing to allow even her most trusted assistants to participate in the final seasoning. She began keeping certain ingredients locked in a wooden box that she wore as a pendant around her neck, claiming these were special spices reserved for the most important occasions. What her staff could not know was that Amara had begun making nocturnal expeditions into the rainforest that surrounded the plantation. Using knowledge inherited from Mama Uzuri, she sought plants that grew only in specific conditions during certain seasons. Vines that wrapped around trees where animals had died. Mushrooms that sprouted from rotting logs in particular soil compositions. Roots that could only be harvested during the dark of the moon when their toxicity reached peak concentration. Mama Uzuri had taught her about these plants when she was younger, always with warnings about their power and the wisdom required to use them safely. The old healer had explained that some knowledge was passed down not for everyday use, but for moments when ordinary justice failed and extraordinary measures became necessary. She had spoken of ancestors who used such knowledge to protect their communities from enemies who could not be defeated through conventional means. During December's early days, Amara began what she privately called her testing phase. Tiny amounts of carefully prepared plant extracts found their way into Marcel's food, doses too small to cause serious harm, but sufficient to produce discomfort that might make him question his health. Stomach cramps that came and went without apparent cause. Headaches that struck during his afternoon activities, bouts of nausea that interrupted his experiments with plantation workers. Marcel complained increasingly about his health, consulting Dr. Laurent, who could find no obvious cause for the symptoms. The doctor suggested various explanations, ranging from dietary changes to tropical disease exposure, but none of his treatments provided relief. Marcel's frustration grew as his physical discomfort interfered with the sadistic activities that had become his primary entertainment. Meanwhile, Amara observed and planned with the patience of someone who understood that revenge served best when it arrived unexpected. She studied the household routines, memorized each guest's dietary preferences as revealed through correspondence and previous visits, calculated timing that would ensure maximum impact with minimum risk of discovery. Most importantly, she began preparing what would be her masterpiece, a wedding banquet where every dish told the story of justice delayed but never forgotten. The magnitude of what would unfold at Villa Mbandaka on December 3, 1923, began with children's laughter echoing through the humid morning air. Bomani, Django, and little Asha had awakened early that Tuesday, drawn by the unusual activity surrounding the estate as final preparations commenced for the evening celebration. Workers scurried between buildings, carrying supplies, decorations, and furniture, while European voices barked orders in French that carried across the compound with the sharp authority of people accustomed to instant obedience. Amara had risen before dawn, as always, but this morning felt different in ways that made her skin prickle with anticipation and dread. She had spent months preparing for this day, not merely the culinary preparations that would showcase her skills before the colony's elite, but other preparations that required knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that justice sometimes demanded tools more subtle than courts or laws. The wedding feast would indeed be memorable, but not for reasons anyone expected. The morning progressed with the mechanical precision of well-rehearsed routine. Yet beneath the surface, currents of change flowed like underground rivers seeking their moment to break through into daylight. Amara moved through her kitchen domain with
The calm efficiency that had made her indispensable, directing her assistants in tasks that would culminate in the most important meal any of them had ever prepared. But her true attention focused on elements invisible to European eyes. The careful timing that would ensure certain ingredients reached peak potency at precisely the right moment. The mental calculations that would deliver personalized justice to each guest based on their individual contributions to the machinery of oppression. Safina worked with unusual concentration on the bread preparations, kneading dough that would become the foundation for appetizers designed to impress guests accustomed to fine dining in Kinshasa and Brussels. The humidity made working with European-style breads challenging, requiring adjustments to recipes that Amara had perfected through years of trial and error. Each loaf needed to maintain its structure despite tropical moisture while providing the perfect vehicle for spreads and garnishes that would showcase local ingredients adapted to continental tastes. Zuberi supervised the smoking process that would transform locally sourced meats into delicacies worthy of the occasion. Wild boar from the deep forest, river fish caught in nets woven by skilled hands, and domesticated fowl raised on scraps from the main house kitchen all required different treatments to achieve textures and flavors that would satisfy European palates while working within the constraints of available fuel and equipment. The smoking shed filled with aromatic clouds that drifted across the compound, announcing to everyone within miles that something extraordinary was being prepared. Dalila worked methodically through vegetables and fruits that would accompany the main courses, her knife moving with the rhythm of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times, yet understood that this occasion demanded perfection beyond anything previously attempted. Tropical fruits needed careful preparation to prevent oxidation in the oppressive heat, while root vegetables required techniques that would enhance their natural flavors without overwhelming the delicate balance that characterized sophisticated cuisine. Throughout the morning, Amara maintained careful oversight of every aspect of food preparation while concealing the additional elements that would transform celebration into catastrophe. Her special ingredients remained secured in the wooden pendant that never left her neck, Each component harvested during specific lunar phases and processed according to methods that Mama Uzuri had taught her during long nights when the old healer shared knowledge too dangerous for daylight conversations. The guests began arriving shortly after midday, their approach announced by the sound of boat engines struggling against the Congo River's powerful current. The dry season had lowered water levels enough to make navigation treacherous, requiring skilled pilots to guide vessels through channels that shifted with each flood and drought cycle. But the promise of witnessing the union between two prominent families had drawn the colonial elite from across the region, each arrival marking another step toward the evening that would reshape the power structure of Belgian Congo's eastern territories. Commandant Auguste Moreau arrived first, his steam launch flying Belgian flags that snapped in the river breeze while uniformed crew members secured mooring lines with military precision. Auguste embodied the particular type of colonial administrator who had thrived in Congo's ivory trade, a man whose wealth flowed from the systematic slaughter of elephant herds that had roamed Central African forests for millennia. His wife Celeste accompanied him, a woman whose correspondence with Elise had revealed her philosophy that Africans existed primarily to serve European comfort, and that any suffering involved in this service was simply the natural order of things. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the groom, displayed the nervous energy of a young man about to formally assume responsibilities that would make him complicit in his father's brutal enterprise. At 22, he had spent 2 years learning the ivory business firsthand, participating in expeditions that penetrated deep into territories where traditional communities still maintained some autonomy from colonial control. His letters to Giselle, which Amara had seen while cleaning the main house, described these ventures with enthusiasm for the profits involved, while remaining carefully silent about the methods required to secure cooperation from local populations. Dr. Victor Laurent arrived next, his medical bag and formal attire creating an image of European scientific authority that masked his primary function as an enabler of systematic abuse. Laurent had spent 15 years in Congo providing just enough medical care to keep forced laborers functional while turning blind eyes to injuries and illnesses that resulted from deliberate violence rather than accident or disease. His presence at social gatherings served to legitimize the fiction that Belgian colonial administration included genuine concern for African welfare. Father Constantine's arrival carried particular significance for the day's religious ceremony, but his role in the colonial system extended far beyond spiritual guidance. The priest had perfected the art of using Christian doctrine to justify economic exploitation, preaching sermons that emphasized obedience to earthly authority while promising heavenly rewards for those who accepted their suffering without complaint. His personal wealth, accumulated through donations extracted from workers who could barely feed their families, funded a lifestyle that rivaled the secular administrators whose policies he blessed from ornate pulpits. Captain Louis Reynard represented the military force that ultimately supported all colonial enterprises, his crisp uniform and ceremonial sword serving as reminders that European authority rested on violence rather than consent. Reynard commanded the regional garrison responsible for suppressing any resistance to Belgian rule, a task he approached with efficiency that had earned commendations from superiors who valued results over methods. His presence at the wedding signaled official approval for the economic alliance being celebrated. The trading couple, Antoine and Marguerite Beaumont, embodied the commercial networks that moved wealth from African labor to European banks while ensuring that local populations received minimal compensation for their efforts. Antoine controlled river transport that connected plantation country with urban markets, a position that allowed him to manipulate prices and supplies in ways that maximized profit extraction. Marguerite managed the social aspects of their business, cultivating relationships with colonial wives whose influence could secure favorable contracts and political protection.
Charles Fontaine arrived with the authority of Brussels behind him.
his role involving direct oversight of colonial administration policies that treated African populations as renewable resources rather than human communities. Fontaine's reports to European superiors had consistently praised the efficiency of Congo's extraction systems while omitting details about the human costs involved in maintaining productivity levels that satisfied investors thousands of miles away. Professor Émile Rousseau and his wife Brigitte represented the intellectual justification for colonial domination, their anthropological studies providing scientific veneer for racial theories that portrayed European superiority as natural law rather than convenient fiction. Rousseau's research focused on documenting what he called primitive customs while ignoring the sophisticated social and technological systems that had sustained Central African communities for centuries before European contact. Each arrival brought new voices to the compound, conversations in French that carried across the humid air with the casual authority of people discussing property rather than human lives. Amara listened carefully to fragments of dialogue that revealed attitudes and information useful for her evening plans. She learned about recent quota increases that would demand even greater suffering from workers already stretched beyond endurance. She heard discussions of expansion plans that would bring colonial exploitation to territories that had thus far maintained some independence. Most importantly, she absorbed details about each guest's personal preferences and vulnerabilities that would inform the specialized preparations she had planned for the evening meal. Auguste Moreau's preference for richly spiced meats reflected his crude palate and provided opportunities for ingredients that would mask other flavors. Dr. Laurent's fondness for wine created possibilities for combinations that would enhance certain chemical reactions. Father Constantine's notorious sweet tooth offered pathways for delivery systems that would appeal to his gluttony while serving justice for his hypocrisy. The afternoon ceremony took place in the villa's main garden, where imported flowers struggled against tropical conditions to provide appropriate European ambiance for the religious service. Giselle appeared radiant in lace that had traveled upriver at enormous expense, her happiness genuine despite the brutal foundation upon which her family's wealth rested. Jean-Baptiste stood beside her with the confident bearing of someone inheriting power without questioning its moral implications. Father Constantine performed the ceremony with theatrical flourishes that emphasized the sacred nature of Christian marriage, while carefully avoiding any reference to the Christian principles of justice and compassion that might challenge colonial practices. His blessing of the union included prayers for prosperity that everyone present understood to mean continued success in extracting wealth from African labor through whatever means proved necessary. Wedding guests observed the ceremony from chairs arranged on the veranda, fanning themselves against heat that made European formal wear uncomfortable despite the approaching evening. Their conversations during the service revealed the casual racism that permeated colonial society. Comments about the primitive decorations contributed by African workers and speculation about whether natives could truly understand the significance of Christian marriage. Amara watched the ceremony from the kitchen doorway, her expression calm, while her mind finalized calculations that would ensure each guest received exactly what their actions had earned. The sight of so much wealth and happiness, built on systematic cruelty, strengthened her resolve, while confirming that conventional justice would never reach people who controlled the very systems designed to protect them from consequences. As afternoon faded toward evening, final preparations accelerated with intensity that matched the approaching culmination of months of planning. The dining room had been transformed into a showcase of European elegance, adapted to tropical conditions. Crystal and silver reflecting candlelight, while ceiling fans stirred air that remained oppressively humid despite the sun's decline. The table setting represented the finest that colonial society could assemble, each element chosen to demonstrate the sophistication that Europeans believed justified their dominance over supposedly inferior peoples. Amara conducted final inspections of every dish that would comprise the evening's menu, her assistants unaware that her leader was implementing plans that extended far beyond culinary excellence. The appetizers featured local ingredients prepared according to European techniques, small portions designed to stimulate appetite while beginning processes that would culminate during later courses. River fish formed delicate spreads on bread that concealed flavors stronger than the herbs and spices that guests would expect. The first course proper consisted of soup crafted from ingredients that showcased Amara's mastery of flavor combinations that could transform simple local produce into something worthy of sophisticated palates. Tropical vegetables provided foundation for broths that incorporated traditional preservation techniques with European presentation standards, creating dishes that satisfied expectations while serving purposes that extended beyond mere nourishment. Main courses represented the pinnacle of Amara's culinary artistry, with each protein prepared according to methods that maximized both flavor and the effectiveness of additional ingredients that guests would never detect. Wild boar had been seasoned with combinations that enhanced the meat's natural richness while providing vehicles for plant extracts that would begin their work slowly, allowing the evening to proceed normally until specific timing brought about desired results. Side dishes complemented the main proteins while serving as additional delivery systems for justice that had been delayed too long. Root vegetables prepared according to traditional methods carried enhanced flavors that would appeal to European tastes, while concealing purposes that reached back to ancestral knowledge about plants that could serve multiple functions depending on preparation and dosage. Desserts provided the final opportunity for ingredients that would complete processes begun during earlier courses. Sweet preparations that would appeal to colonial preferences for sugar, while ensuring that no guest would escape the consequences of their participation in systematic oppression.
Unfamiliar discomfort began. Throughout the preparation process, Amara's assistants worked with dedication born of pride in their skills and desire to demonstrate African capabilities that colonial propaganda claimed did not exist. Safina's breads achieved textures that rivaled anything produced in European bakeries, while Zuberi's meat preparations showcased smoking techniques that enhanced flavors in ways that imported spices could not match. Delilah's vegetable work demonstrated artistic sensibilities that transformed simple ingredients into visual masterpieces worthy of the most sophisticated presentations. None of them suspected that their leader had transformed the kitchen into something beyond a place of food preparation, that their innocent collaboration was enabling justice that conventional systems had proven incapable of delivering. Amara carried this knowledge alone, understanding that some burdens could not be shared without destroying the effectiveness of actions that required absolute secrecy until the moment of revelation. The dining room filled with guests whose conversations revealed the casual cruelty that characterized colonial social gatherings. Discussions of labor problems that treated human suffering as minor inconveniences to be solved through increased violence. Wine flowed from bottles that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote outpost of European civilization, each glass representing wealth extracted from people who lacked access to clean drinking water, despite living beside one of the world's great rivers. Laughter echoed across the compound as guests shared anecdotes about their experiences managing African populations, stories that revealed attitudes that would have shocked European audiences, but seemed perfectly normal among people who had spent years treating human beings as agricultural equipment. The wedding celebration provided opportunity for social bonding that strengthened networks of mutual support among colonial administrators whose individual success depended on collective commitment to maintaining systems of exploitation. Amara observed these preparations from her kitchen domain,
understanding that she was witnessing the final hours of lives that had caused immeasurable suffering while existing in complete comfort and security. Tomorrow would bring different conversations, different laughter, different revelations about the true nature of power in colonial Africa. But tonight belonged to celebration that would transform into something else entirely. Something that would demonstrate that justice could emerge from the most unexpected sources when conventional systems failed to protect the innocent. The moment had arrived for the most important meal that Amara would ever prepare, courses that would serve purposes extending far beyond nutrition or even culinary artistry. Each dish represented months of preparation, years of learning, generations of knowledge passed down through women who understood that survival sometimes required tools that civilization preferred to ignore. The wedding feast was about to begin, and with it, the evening that would prove that those who consider themselves invisible to power often possess the greatest capacity to reshape the world through patience, knowledge, and the courage to act when action becomes unavoidable. Evening descended over Villa Mbandaka with the sudden finality that characterized equatorial sunsets, transforming golden afternoon into velvet darkness within minutes that left Europeans perpetually surprised by tropical rhythms so different from continental seasons. Torches flickered along pathways connecting the main house to outbuildings, their flames dancing in humid air that carried sounds of night creatures awakening in rainforest depths that pressed against the compound's carefully maintained boundaries. The transformation of Amara Nkomo from grieving mother to methodical agent of justice had begun months earlier, but its roots stretched back through years of accumulated observations about the true nature of colonial society. Every casual cruelty witnessed, every family separated for administrative convenience, every worker beaten for failing to meet impossible quotas had contributed to an understanding that conventional concepts of law and morality served only to protect those who benefited from systematic oppression. The catalyst for her metamorphosis arrived on a morning that had begun like countless others, with routine tasks and familiar rhythms that provided illusion of stability in lives governed by forces beyond their control. Bomani had awakened early to help with equipment maintenance, his natural mechanical curiosity making him useful for tasks that required small hands and careful attention to detail. Django had followed his older brother as always, eager to learn skills that might someday provide him with valued position within the plantation's complex hierarchy of labor and survival. Little Asha had remained near the kitchen area as instructed, playing with toys fashioned from corn husks while staying close enough to her mother for comfort and protection. The morning had proceeded according to established patterns that had kept the family safe through 8 years of careful navigation between the demands of European masters and the preservation of African dignity and identity. Marcel Dubois had been observing the children's routines for weeks, noting their movements and responsibilities with the same methodical attention that he applied to all his scientific research projects. His university education had convinced him that scientific advancement required experimentation on subjects who could provide data about racial characteristics and responses to various stimuli. The plantation workers represented perfect laboratory specimens for studies that would enhance European understanding of African capabilities and limitations. The storage shed where Marcel conducted his experiments stood isolated from the main compound, positioned to provide privacy for activities that might disturb European sensibilities while remaining close enough for convenient access. The building had originally served to house equipment too valuable to leave exposed to weather, but too bulky for secure storage elsewhere. Its solid construction and single entrance made it ideal for purposes that required containment and control of research subjects. Bomani's mechanical curiosity had drawn him toward the shed that morning, attracted by sounds of machinery that suggested interesting equipment worth investigating. His knowledge of plantation operations had made him confident about moving through areas where his presence was normally tolerated, unaware that Marcel had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity to begin experiments that would test theories about African responses to European authority.
Innocent questions about the boy's understanding of machinery and his ability to perform complex tasks that required intelligence and coordination. Marcel's approach reflected techniques learned during university psychology courses, methods designed to establish trust before introducing elements that would reveal true character under pressure. Bomani answered questions with the bright enthusiasm of someone eager to demonstrate knowledge and capability. Django had followed his brother into the shed, curious about the conversation and unwilling to remain outside while interesting activities occurred beyond his view. His presence provided Marcel with additional research opportunities, chances to observe sibling dynamics and comparative responses to identical stimuli applied to subjects of different ages and similar backgrounds and training. Little Asha had become concerned when her brothers failed to return from their morning explorations, her anxiety driving her to search for them despite instructions to remain near the kitchen area. Her arrival at the shed completed Marcel's research group, providing him with subjects representing different developmental stages and gender characteristics that would enhance the scientific value of his experiments. What followed in that isolated building reflected the logical extension of colonial attitudes that treated African lives as resources available for European purposes without regard for consent or consequence. Marcel's experiments drew upon techniques he had studied in textbooks that described methods for testing physical endurance, pain tolerance, and psychological responses to various forms of stress and humiliation. The children's screams eventually reached workers in nearby areas, but the sound of African suffering had become so commonplace that few paused to investigate its source. Those who did recognize the sounds understood that intervention would only result in their own families becoming targets for similar treatment, a calculation that reflected the effectiveness of colonial systems designed to prevent collective resistance through individual terror. Amara discovered the tragedy when she realized that her children had not appeared for their midday meal, an absence that violated established routines and triggered maternal instincts that had kept them safe through years of careful vigilance. Her search led inevitably to the storage shed, where she found evidence of activities that transformed her understanding of her family's vulnerability and the true nature of European intentions toward African children. The sight that greeted her in that shed destroyed whatever illusions remained about the possibility of protecting innocent lives through compliance and collaboration with colonial authority. Marcel's experiments had been thorough and methodical, designed to extract maximum scientific value from subjects whose screams had provided data about African responses to European creativity in the application of psychological and physical pressure. Bomani, Django, and Asha lay motionless on the shed floor, their small bodies bearing evidence of research that had pushed the boundaries of human endurance in service of theories about racial characteristics and pain tolerance. Marcel's notebook, left carelessly on a nearby table, contained detailed observations about each child's responses to various stimuli, recorded with the dispassionate precision of someone documenting livestock behavior rather than human suffering. The notebook revealed that Marcel's experiments had been planned for weeks, with careful attention to variables that would maximize the scientific value of his research while minimizing the risk of interference from parents or other plantation workers. The children had been selected specifically because of their ages, genders, and family relationships, factors that would provide data about how African family structures responded to the systematic removal of individual members. Amara's initial response combined the animal howl of maternal grief with the more complex emotions of someone whose worldview had been shattered by direct confrontation with evil that exceeded even her darkest expectations about colonial cruelty. The sound that emerged from her throat carried pain too deep for ordinary expression, a vocalization that seemed to emerge from depths of suffering that human language could not address. But even as grief threatened to destroy her sanity, other parts of her mind began processing information with the cold efficiency that would characterize her transformation from victim to agent of justice.
Marcel's notebook provided detailed insights into his psychology and methods, information that would prove valuable for planning responses that conventional justice systems would never attempt to implement. The realization that her children's deaths had been conducted as scientific experiments rather than random violence added layers of outrage that focused her grief into something harder and more dangerous than simple desire for revenge. The systematic nature of Marcel's cruelty demanded responses that matched its methodical character, justice that would demonstrate African capacity for strategic thinking that European theories claimed was impossible. Hours passed in that isolated building as Amara absorbed the full implications of what she had discovered, her mind cycling through rage and despair before settling into the calm determination that would guide her actions during the months ahead. The notebook in her hands contained not just evidence of Marcel's crimes, but insights into the psychological weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with patience and knowledge sufficient to plan responses that would match the crime's magnitude. When she finally emerged from the shed, carrying the bodies of her children toward the quarters where other families would help prepare them for burial, Amara had already begun the mental process that would transform her from Amara the cook into something more dangerous. The woman who entered that building believed that protection was possible through skill and usefulness. The woman who emerged understood that safety was an illusion maintained by people who had never experienced the full extent of European willingness to destroy African lives for entertainment and education. The funeral took place 3 days later with ceremonies that blended Christian forms imposed by colonial authority with traditional practices that honored ancestors and acknowledged the continuing presence of the dead among the living. Father Constantine officiated with perfunctory attention to ritual requirements while displaying no genuine concern for the loss of lives he considered scientifically inferior to European children whose deaths would have demanded investigation and punishment. Quito's grief manifested as the desperate numbness of someone whose world had been rendered incomprehensible by direct confrontation with evil that exceeded even his darkest expectations about colonial brutality.
Loss that exceeded his ability to process or accept. His wife's responses concerned him more than his own pain. Her calm acceptance of sympathy and her methodical attention to funeral arrangements suggesting psychological changes that he could sense but not understand. The plantation community gathered to honor children whose deaths represented a warning about the fate that awaited any family whose members attracted unwanted attention from Europeans who possessed absolute power over African lives. Conversations during the funeral reflected awareness that conventional protection strategies had failed, leaving everyone vulnerable to violence that could strike without warning or justification. Marcel attended the funeral as demonstration of European sympathy for African loss, his presence serving to remind everyone that the same authority responsible for the deaths also controlled any possibility of justice or accountability. His expressions of condolence reflected the casual insincerity of someone offering comfort for damage he had inflicted deliberately while planning similar future research projects. Philippe's response to his son's activities revealed the extent to which colonial authority protected Europeans from consequences for actions that would have resulted in severe punishment if directed toward white victims. The commandant's primary concern involved ensuring that Marcel's research did not interfere with plantation productivity, a calculation that treated worker morale as an administrative problem rather than human rights issue. Dr. Laurent's medical examination of the children's bodies provided official documentation that attributed their deaths to accidental injuries rather than deliberate violence, his findings reflecting institutional commitment to protecting Europeans from legal consequences for actions taken against African populations. The doctor's report would become part of colonial records that portrayed Marcel's experiments as tragic misunderstanding rather than systematic torture. The notebook that Amara had discovered remained hidden in her quarters, its contents studied each night by candlelight as she absorbed details about Marcel's psychology and methods that would inform her planning for responses that would match his cruelty with precision and effectiveness. The document provided insights into European attitudes and vulnerabilities that conventional resistance movements had never possessed. During the weeks following the funeral, subtle changes in Amara's behavior reflected the internal transformation that was redirecting her grief toward purposes that extended beyond personal revenge. Her work in the kitchen continued with the same excellence that had made her indispensable, but observers noted increased attention to details that seemed unrelated to culinary requirements. Her nocturnal expeditions into the surrounding rainforest began during this period, journeys that utilized knowledge inherited from Mama Uzuri about plants whose properties required careful harvesting and preparation before they could serve purposes that extended beyond ordinary medicinal applications. The forest provided resources that European science had never catalogued, natural compounds that could serve justice when conventional systems failed to protect the innocent. The decision to rename herself occurred during one of these midnight explorations, when the depth of her transformation demanded acknowledgement through symbols that would mark her evolution from victim to agent of change. Amara and Como would continue to exist as far as the plantation community knew, but privately she had become someone new, someone capable of actions that the old Amara could never have contemplated. Quito sensed these changes without understanding their implications, his wife's grief expressing itself through alterations in behavior that suggested psychological responses beyond normal mourning processes. Her increasing detachment from emotional connections that had previously defined her identity worried him, but his own pain prevented him from recognizing the planning that occupied her thoughts during quiet moments. The wedding announcement arrived during this period of internal transformation, carrying news that would provide perfect opportunity for justice that could reach all 15 individuals whose participation in colonial exploitation had made Marcel's crimes possible. The celebration would gather them in circumstances that would enable responses carefully tailored to each person's specific contributions to systematic oppression. Months of preparation followed, during which Amara's public persona remained unchanged, while her private activities focused on acquiring knowledge and materials necessary for justice that would demonstrate African capabilities that European theories claimed were impossible. The kitchen became her laboratory, traditional cooking techniques adapted to serve purposes that extended far beyond nutrition or even culinary artistry. The transformation was complete by the time December arrived, with its promise of wedding celebrations that would unite two prominent families while providing opportunity for justice that had been delayed too long. The woman who had lost 3 children to European cruelty had evolved into someone capable of ensuring that such loss would never be repeated. Someone who understood that protection sometimes required actions that civilization preferred to ignore, but history sometimes demanded.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.